Well, I've always enjoyed writing. You know, I studied English in college. I got to the point of finishing up an MA in the subject at the University of Minnesota, English and History. And after I finished that, I still had 3 years left on the GI Bill. And so I switched over to what is now the Carlson School, and completed an MBA in accounting with the idea of making myself employable, which it did. It certainly did. I'll give it that, because I worked steadily at that for 37 years, and it always paid the bills. And it was interesting work. Most of that career was actually at the university. I came back to work because the university has many accountants on staff. So it was a good career, but something was missing, and that was that basically my creative impulses, you might say, were being stifled, and that was a choice on my part, because I could have written in my spare time, but job responsibilities, family responsibilities, I didn't do much. Part of what I enjoyed most about my job was actually writing up short descriptions of what I wanted my clients to know. You know, I would give them the financial statements, and then, but I thought, yes, but these are academic people. They don't care that much about these numbers of them as such. What they want to know is, what do these numbers say? You know, do I have enough money? How much discretionary money do I have? That kind of thing. So even though it wasn't required, I liked writing up these little executive summaries, you might say. Basically, I seized any opportunity to write that I could squeeze into an accounting career. But finally, I retired back in 2009, and at that point, of course, I had the time to devote to it. And after but the question was, what am I going to write about? Well, my son more than once asked me, he said, I don't know much about Vietnam, Dad, and he said, but I can find that on the internet. What I'd like to know more about is what you did, in the Army. That's not on the internet. What can you tell me about that? And I said, well, I will, a little bit, of course, orally, but I said, I've been looking for a writing project, and I think this is it. I believe I started to realize this is something like Kurt Vonnegut. He always knew he needed to write the Dresden book, which became Slaughterhouse-Five. It took him decades to get to that point. And I think in my subconscious I'd known that I always needed to write the Vietnam book, because there were some emotions associated with my military service that I hadn't successfully processed. And so the desire to write and the subject came together. And as we were talking about earlier, I had a number of primary sources, because I had the letters that I wrote to Bev and my family, and the letters they wrote back to me. And of course, these days with the internet, there's so much information out there. And so I thought, well, this is going to be a challenge to try to put this all together, but the letters will give me a framework. And just coincidentally, back about 6 months before I went into the service, in September of '68, I started journaling also, because I was in grad school at the time. And I wanted to write, but I thought, well, what am I going to write about? Because, every good writer says, write what you know. Hemingway always said that, write what you know. And so I thought, well, what do I know? I'm not sure, but what I'm just going to start doing is setting down my thoughts and description of my daily activities, and that'll at least give me experience writing, and then we'll see where that goes. So as a result of that, I didn't realize it, but a very significant period of my life was about to unfold. Namely, I was about to be drafted into the Army, which was not a big surprise. The biggest surprise was meeting Bev, now my wife of 46 years. And of course, you never know when something like that's going to happen, but it did. So coincidentally, this journal which lasted for the 6 months before I went into the service. That covered this period of our meeting and courtship. And then once I went into the service, then the letters took over. So as a result, these 2 years of my life were more extensively documented, far more than any other period of my life. So I had these primary sources, and I thought this will provide the framework, and then I'll flesh it out with additional descriptions of events, international, national, but more specifically, heavier emphasis on local, and try to give the reader an immersive experience of what it was like to live back in those years, because that was what I wanted to do for our son, and part of the reason for that is I'd give anything if I had something like that done by my parents, and I don't. Dad was in the Navy during World War II, and he was always stateside, and he was married. They were already married at the time, and so they, at that time, enlisted sailors were authorized to live off base if they were married with their spouses. Of course, not if they were overseas. The spouses didn't come along then, but if they were stateside. So they were stationed down at the Naval Air Station at Miami, and then the one out in Santa Rosa. And Dad was scheduled to be shipped overseas on a carrier for the invasion of Japan when in August of '45, the atomic bombs were dropped, the war ended. He never left San Francisco. So I thought, there is a story there, and now it's a story I'll never know except for the bare bones. And I thought I'd like to leave our son and our grandchildren and those coming after them with more of a legacy. So this was part of my motivation. Now, the question comes up of, so I chose memoir for my genre rather than fiction. And I make the distinction between, there's a distinction that scholars typically make between autobiography and memoir, and that memoir typically deals with a person's experience living through significant events. So it gives more attention to the surrounding events, historical events, than a typical autobiography will, although obviously that distinction is fuzzy. But I do draw the distinction between memoir and journaling, because for me journaling is strictly for the writer's use, whatever use it serves for them, perhaps just the exercise of writing, what they learn in self-knowledge from sorting through their thoughts, feelings, just to put them down on paper. But I always think of journaling as primarily not directed toward a reader, whereas memoir, or fiction certainly, I can't imagine writing that without a reader in mind. And so, our son, grandchildren, they would be one significant part of the audience. But I thought what I want to do here is write the book that I wish my dad or my mom had written. Not just what you did, but what you felt, what was going on at the same time, what it was basically. Try to describe what it was like to live through those times, because those were important times, World War II. And I thought, well, I can do that. This is something I want to do, and something I enjoy doing, since I've always enjoyed writing. So memoir was the genre, and then I discussed this my approach to the project in the prologue to the book also. Because then the next question comes up, well, okay, it's memoir, but even so, I studied literature enough to know that you still have to define the narrator. The obvious answer is the narrator is me. I'm talking about my own life, but which me? The me of 50 years ago, when these events were occurring, or the me of today? Now, to try to make it the me of 50 years ago would have basically been fiction, because he no longer exists. And so that would require me to try to put aside everything, my attitudes that have changed, all the events that occurred in the last 50 years, everything we've learned about the war in Vietnam over the last half century. So to me, that would have made it basically fiction, because I would have been trying to recreate a character that existed in the past, namely the 23-year-old me. And so the way I describe it now, the narrator, the narrative voice, is a conversation between the 23-year-old me and the contemporary me. And the younger man, as is typical, is often angry, and he doesn't like the way he sees the world. He thinks he sees a lot of things wrong with it, and he has many opinions. The older man, he's often amused by the younger one's youthful naivete, but he always takes him seriously, and he tries to leaven the view with some of whatever wisdom he might have acquired over the intervening decades. And so now I should, I don't mind. This is a personal book. It's a confession of sorts, you might say. So I don't mind being personal in the interview also. There were many years when these two men didn't get along very well. And this is part of what I'm talking about when I discuss the unprocessed emotions from my military service. And since they had no choice but to live together, they attempted to bridge the gap between them with alcohol. Now, 30 years ago, I started walking the path of recovery, and like so many millions before me, I've discovered the thing that, the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill and Bob, their great discovery, and not everyone agrees with this, but I do, is that alcohol at its root is a spiritual malaise. Regardless of how it starts, ultimately it involves the drinker inhabiting a spiritual wasteland. He's basically what it is. It's a form of idolatry, because an object has been given power. An inanimate object has been given power. That's your most basic definition of idolatry. In this case, the inanimate object is alcohol, a mood-altering substance. And so I started walking the path of recovery 30 years ago, and I still regularly attend meetings. Now, I need to remember, I may not even bring this up when we're recording, but what I need to remember is not to mention the name of the organization, because that's not supposed to be named in the public, at the level of media. But anyway, in any case, what I'm leading up to here is that those two guys, the old me and the contemporary me, they get along well enough now to collaborate on a book. And I think that would be a true acid test of any relationship. So, in other words, I was ready to write the book. Like Vonnegut with his Dresden book, finally I was ready. The time had come. I started writing about 5 years ago, and I learned a lot about myself during the process. I learned a lot about events that were going on at the time. I thought I had a good understanding of it, and of course it was a pretty solid understanding since I lived through it, but there was a lot I didn't know too. A lot has come to light since then. So that basically describes the creative process, the approach I was taking, the narrative voice, and my goals.
Well, as I understand part of your process, you had a bunch of letters in order.
Mm-hmm.
So you had all that work that somebody might have to do by memory dredging, or you had pretty precisely. You could date all sorts of events.
Yes, it's what a historian terms primary sources.
And then you also had a pretty rich public record to fill in the timeline for this long period, parallel to this personal record.
Mm-hmm.
So you were in a kind of a pretty ideal situation to understand this period of time. once you had the structure in mind, once you had the structure established, the 3 feet of files
Yeah.
in order, where did you begin?
Well, that was the first question I asked myself. I could give someone a thumbnail account of my service in the Army, and I think it might be mildly interesting to my son and my grandchildren, but it wouldn't be particularly interesting because, for one thing, I was never in combat. I was behind the lines. I was a clerk typist, and so I could do that. But I thought I want to do more than that. So the question became, okay, then where do I start? And this is why I started with my senior year in high school, because that's when things changed. The death of President Kennedy, especially, Churchill used the title for one of his volumes on the history of World War II, The Hinge of Fate. I think when JFK died, the hinge of fate turned. And I was a senior in high school, and a lot of us were already growing somewhat discontent with, well, we had been during the last of the Eisenhower years. Things seemed stale, boring, comfortable, yes, a lot of material prosperity, but what else? What else? We were looking for something else. Kennedy came in, and things seemed to change. The new frontier, and the challenge, setting up the Peace Corps, and the call to service. Ask not what his great inaugural address. Ask not what your country can do for you. It was inspiring. And then when he was killed, and basically what seemed like we didn't know anything about Johnson, but what seemed like basically a conventional old school politician came in. There was a lot of anger. There was a feeling of being cheated, and then about 2 months later, the Beatles hit, and music started reflecting our discontent. And then, Johnson started upping the ante in Vietnam, which I don't believe I'd ever heard of when I was in high school. It was early in 1965 that the first U.S. ground combat troops went in, as opposed to Kennedy had sent in a lot of advisors. But Johnson is the one, of course, who committed the combat troops. So I wanted to start. I decided to start with my senior year in high school. I give a brief in the first chapter. I give a brief thumbnail sketch of my growing years. Kids in the 50s, and the reason I do that is because of the fear of communism that permeated the national conversation back in those years, because there you have the roots of what happened in Vietnam. There was this belief in a monolithic international communist conspiracy, and you often heard the phrase, if we don't stop them there, next thing you know, they'll be in California, they'll be at our doorstep. And there was this fear, and the knowledge that now the communists also had the atomic bomb, and the only thing preventing them from using it was mutually assured destruction, to John Foster Dulles' famous phrase. So it was the balance of terror. And so JFK, I believe this was also in his inaugural address, he described our situation as a long twilight struggle. This is a Cold War, occasionally with, flashes, flare-ups, like in Korea, or that's the most, before Vietnam, that was the most significant example. But there would never be a conventional total war again, because atomic weapons would be used and both sides would be virtually obliterated. And so I do, because of this brief thumbnail background of what it was like growing up in those years, the good parts, because basically I think it was a great time to be a kid. I wouldn't trade my baby boomer childhood for anything. I think it was a wonderful time to grow up, the 1950s. But things had started to change. We were starting to feel this vague feeling of discontent. I remember when beatniks became part of popular culture, and we thought, well, we didn't know anything about Burroughs or Kerouac or Ginsberg, the really significant writers of that school, but we just knew orthopedics, that's pretty cool. There's some people out there who aren't buying into this whole, white bread Eisenhower America type of thing. And I never give that a lot of serious consideration. But when Kennedy died, and when Johnson started to commit us seriously in Vietnam, I wanted to include that part also. So because of that, I start with my senior year in high school, and then go all through my undergraduate years at the university, because this was the time of the buildup in Vietnam. I didn't get over there until October of 1969. That was well over a year and a half after the climax of the war, which was the Tet Offensive. So things were already starting to wind down somewhat by that time. So I thought, well, if I start when I got to Vietnam, then, yeah, true, that's the start of my tour of duty, but it's not the start of the war. And I'd like my readers to, I'd like to try to give them some understanding of how this happened, where we got where we were by the time I got over there. So that's where I chose to start.
So, what was your household like in this early period? Were you and your parents in pretty good agreement about political matters? Were there disputes? Was the sense still during that early period that things were basically okay and basically understandable, and you knew what your duty was, that kind of thing?
Yeah, basically you've described it exactly. We were typical Cold War kids. It was a big Catholic family. I've got 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and then my mother's mother lived with us also, my grandmother. So there were 8 of us, 10 houses on this side of the block. 8 of us belonged to St. Charles Borromeo. We all went to the Catholic school. It was like, everything seemed to be cut and dried. There was no question in our mind that America was the greatest country in the world. We'd basically saved the world from dictatorship during World War II. And then we proved how magnanimous we were by bringing both Germany and Japan, reestablishing their economies, instead of trying to punish them. Like, that was the great mistake at the end of World War I, attempting to punish Germany. And we know what the result of that was. So there was no doubt that, America was the greatest country. Catholicism was the perfect society, the perfect religion. God was at the top of it. The Pope reported to him, and the cardinals, and the bishops, and the priests. The priests were like the local representative of God. I mean, what they sent went. That was the era of the pastor as parish dictator, basically. And so there were all these cut and dried rules, and that makes for a very pleasant mindset for a child, because there aren't many questions. If you have a question, the answer is there. It'll be in church doctrine or the nation's laws, and this is one reason. I've got to tell you, I'm a sucker for 1950s nostalgia. The chrome-legged Formica top kitchen sets, the Fiesta ware, the atomic clocks, all that stuff. I see those things at a yard sale or an antique show or a museum, and I'm right back there. It takes me right back. But the reason, those are just window dressing. The real reason it was such a pleasant era for me is that there was so little conflict. It was like the diametric opposite of the 1960s. We didn't question authority. So growing up, my dad, my parents were both, they grew up over on the north side. They went to Ascension, North High. They were Polars over there. And they, considering the environment that they came out of, they grew up in an era when Minneapolis was known as a hotbed of anti-Semitism and racism, certainly, although that wasn't very overt at the time, for the simple reason that there weren't enough African American residents of the city to pose a threat. And I give my parents all the credit in the world because I know that they came out of an environment where there was a lot of racial prejudice, and never once can I recall either one of them say using a derogatory term about a minority group. So, so yes, I was in agreement with my parents. I looked up to them, loved them. I'm one of the fortunate ones who had a happy childhood. Remember what Dostoevsky said in the Brothers Karamazov, that just one happy childhood memory can often be enough to represent a person's salvation. Well, I had a lot of them, and so that's what it was like growing up back in the 50s. Now, like I said, toward the end, as we reached adolescence and the last years of the Eisenhower administration, it started to seem a little stale, perhaps. But then Kennedy came in, and well, this is good, you know. That was back when people still respected their leaders, you know. I loved Kennedy. I didn't just respect him. I mean, he represented everything that seemed good about America. I mean, he was a war hero. Remember the song about him, PT 109? Sure, Eisenhower was great, and he also was a war hero in his own right, but can anybody ever imagine a popular song about Eisenhower? You know, he just wasn't, he wasn't Mr. Excitement, Mr. Debonair like Kennedy was. So yes, in answer to your question, growing up, my folks and I, we didn't have any disagreements, serious ones that I can recall, because we were all on the same page. We were living in the same universe, same church, same country, you know, and that's what made that era such a pleasant thing for a child. Children like certainty, you know, and we had it back in that era. Now, a lot of it was based on a veneer that wasn't real. You know, we came to see when the civil rights era started, that a lot of what we saw as the the golden age of the 1950s was built on oppressing minorities. It was built on, well, should I use the term oppressing women? I'm not sure about that, but what made the 50s lifestyle popular, the sitcom lifestyle, is that nearly all the moms stayed at home. You know, that was, we didn't have daycare, we didn't have babysitters, you know, we could run around the neighborhood all the time because we were home with our friends. But the downside of that is that prevented millions of women from reaching their full professional and economic potential. And we didn't understand that a lot of our dads, the breadwinners, being the sole breadwinner involves a lot of stress. A lot of them had to put up with, the stale life of the organization man, or the physically grueling work on an assembly line or some kind of manual labor. We didn't realize that this perfect world that the folks who grew up during the Depression were creating for their children, to give them all the stuff they never had when they were growing up, that a lot of people sacrificed a lot to provide that. We didn't realize that until we got older ourselves and started to experience those same responsibilities and start to think, how did mom and dad do that? How did they raise 5 kids? I mean, it must have taken a tremendous amount of sacrifice and patience. And so this is the kind of thing you learn when the roles change and you become the next generation.
As I remember, we're not quite the same age, but close.
Mm-hmm.
And as I remember growing up in a somewhat different, but not all that different situation,
Mm-hmm.
I remember that the possibility of military service was always, a fascination and a puzzle all at once. for me it was a puzzle, partly because I was paying attention in catechism class, and so it just seemed bizarre that there should be this expectation of killing people,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems very strange that one should get oneself into a position to be killed. That seemed way out of sync with all the other things in normal life.
Mm-hmm.
This business of, the draft and military service, and that as an important thing. And I'm wondering, was it also in some ways a jarring element in your life, or did it somehow get normalized in this great normalization of everything?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question because, like everything in our lives, the lives of the boomers, and I was born in 1946, by the way, so was my wife, so we're the first wave. In fact, just by coincidence, Bev was born exactly 9 months after VE Day, so you might say she's the very first, that might be the day when the baby boom started, 9 months after the end of the war in Europe. But that's just by coincidence. But her dad wasn't even in the service. But yeah. So we grew up in the shadow of World War II, and the idea was that national service. This is what won the war. This is what saved the world. The citizen soldier. It was an obligation that I didn't give a lot of thought to growing up, because the thought was that even if I served, it most likely would not be in a war. But when I turned 18, of course, I became eligible for the draft. I had a student deferment because I was a student at the university, so I thought, well, I won't be going in for at least 4 years. Now I started at the U in the fall of '64, so Vietnam wasn't even an issue at that point. But I did have to register for the draft. And I also enrolled in Army ROTC because my thinking was I'm almost certainly going to have to serve eventually, so it may as well be as an officer. That seemed to make sense at the time. A lot of things that seemed like insanity later made sense at the time. And so I studied military science along with my other courses for 2 years. And then, by the time my sophomore year came to an end, this was the spring of '66. By that time we could see what was going on over in Vietnam. And my thinking was, things have changed here. And I may end up in the Army, I may even end up in Vietnam, but one thing I'm not going to be is a second lieutenant in the infantry, because when you were commissioned after ROTC, you were a second lieutenant, which is the most junior grade of officer. And also, you didn't necessarily have your choice of what your specialty was going to be. And they needed infantrymen in Vietnam. Now, second lieutenants in the infantry, along with buck sergeants, which is an E5, they had two of the highest rates of casualties over there, because those are the ones who actually lead their men in combat. They aren't the ones sitting back in the office planning what's going to happen or where troops are going to go, which airstrikes are going to come in. They're the ones out there in the field, So my thinking was, I may end up over there, I don't know, but it's not going to be as a second lieutenant in the infantry. So, you didn't have to make a commitment to accept a commission until the end of your sophomore year, because they didn't start paying you until your junior year. So I went in, I had an interview with our commanding officer, Colonel Beard, his name was at the time, over in the Armory building and at the university. And I told him that I'm dropping the program. And he said, well, I could tell he was disappointed. He didn't like to lose a man. And he said, well, what about your military obligation? And I said, well, if I get drafted, I won't go unless I'm drafted. And if I'm drafted, I'll be an enlisted man. And he didn't like that. He thought that well, his thinking was, you have the potential to be an officer, why would you do that? And I didn't tell him, because I don't want to be killed in combat. I wasn't that specific. I just said, well, I don't think it's right for me. You know, I've done it for 2 years and it doesn't seem right. And he said fine. He had no alternative. I was a civilian. He couldn't order me to continue in the program. And so then after I finished my undergraduate work, I started graduate school. The main reason for that was not to evade the draft, although that was a nice benefit, but the main reason was because I wanted to teach college, and of course you need an advanced degree to do that. And so, but that's when they changed the rules and started giving young men 4 years on their student deferment and then cutting it off, whether you graduated or not, or whether you were in grad school. The idea was equity. There were people complaining that, you know, some guys had figured this out, smart college boys. You didn't have to be that smart to figure it out. You could stay in college until the war ended, you know, taking course after course, and you'd never go into the service. People decided that's not fair, and so the Selective Service changed the rules so that they would cut you off after 4 years. That's what happened to me. The lottery wasn't in effect yet. That didn't go into effect until the following year. Just by coincidence, my birth date, which is October 3rd, had a high number. So if I hadn't been drafted that first year of graduate school, I wouldn't have gone in at all, which would have been perfectly fine with me. But I got called up, and I did go in as an enlisted man, just like I told the colonel I would do. And so, but yeah, you know, to go back to your initial question of the reality of military service when I was growing up, my cousin Jim served a hitch in the Marine Corps, the peacetime Marine Corps in between Korea and Vietnam. And I always thought, well, peacetime Army might be sort of boring, but it might be sort of interesting too. And I wasn't about to do it unless I got called up. Wasn't about to volunteer, but then Vietnam came up, and that changed everything. Then the emphasis for me and most of my friends was, how do I stay out of this? You know, it just changed the whole mindset toward military service because, you know, when the war started, I believed the intervention was just. I bought into the, you know, I'd been brought up in the Cold War era and the fear of communism and the idea that if we don't stop them over there, they'll be on the West Coast before long. I bought into that. As the war went along, especially after the Tet Offensive in early '68, I started to believe that this is not a doable mission. This is mission impossible that we've sent our troops over there for, and it's just a waste having these guys keep getting killed over there because it's going to end in a stalemate of some sort. We aren't going to win this. And so that's when the emphasis became, then do I want to risk my life for a mistake? Why would I want to do that, you know? How do I get out of this? Well, eventually my options ran out. My number came up, my draft board called me, and then my options were leave the country, go to federal prison, or go underground, or the fourth option, go into the service. I chose the fourth one.
So, you've chosen to write a pretty long book, and these things go, and the models for war books that have a large audience are the things they carried. All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah.
I mean, they're really manageable books. The Red Badge of Courage. Okay.
Yeah.
And you've chosen to do something different, and you've chosen a different audience. And in part, it's your kids and grandkids. And there's something you want them to see that justifies 5 years of work telling the long story as opposed to the little bit in the middle that would really be, you know, would grab a lot of people and would satisfy them that they had a book.
Yeah.
I mean, at some point, they're going to feel good if they have a book by you.
Mm-hmm.
The size of the book is your choice.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess I'm curious, just looking over the project now that it's done in 2 volumes,
Mm-hmm.
with what, 400 pictures,
Yeah.
including a lot you took yourself.
Yes.
I mean, the first thing a person would say, just even before opening it, is he did a lot more work than he needed to.
Mm-hmm.
What's your hope about how this kind of thing might be of use to your kids, your grandkids, those generations that have a connection to you such that they feel like they're reading their own story in a way when they read about this?
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned relatively short war books. You mentioned the Red Badge of Courage and the things they carried. On the other end of the spectrum, I've got From Here to Eternity up there on the shelf, over 800 pages. So they do vary, but
Yes.
but and by the way, the things they carry, just by coincidence, I met Tim O'Brien last night for the first time over at McAllister. He was giving a presentation in connection with the Burns-Novick Vietnam project, and it was an extremely interesting conversation. Okay, so my own book, I don't, the second part of the title is a memoir of the Vietnam years. It's not primarily, even though the Vietnam War dominated everything back in that era, at least for people of my age group, I don't see it as primarily a war story, and the most basic reason for that is I was not in combat. There's no combat, there's no carnage, at least none that I've witnessed directly myself in the book. I describe some, that happened other locations. Not a lot. That's not my primary emphasis. I see it primarily as a work of historical memoir. And now, one thing that compelled me to write this is that, and a major reason, I mentioned some. Well, for one thing, obviously, I like to write. Nobody writes a book like that unless they enjoy it, but enjoy the process, I should say. But the thing is, I don't believe that a lot of the lessons of that era, and they were lessons that were won at such incredible cost, I don't believe they've been learned. We had our leaders lie to us once again to get us into Iraq, the weapons of mass destruction thing. We have the mission in Afghanistan, morphing into nation building, the same goal we had in Vietnam. And, we've been there for 16 years now in Afghanistan. And now we're told that, we can't pull out until things stabilize. Okay, on the face of it, that statement makes sense, but look at the history of Afghanistan. The English were defeated there, the Russians, who are far more brutal than us, were defeated there. If they couldn't succeed, what makes us think we can? And so, once again, we're not as deeply involved as Vietnam, but we're in this quagmire. That was the common metaphor during the Vietnam War. We're in this quagmire where we can't leave until the citizens of that nation arrive at some steady state, you might say. Well, it never happened in Vietnam, not the way we want to see it happen anyway. And it's pretty hard to believe that's going to happen in Afghanistan with a history of tribal warfare, now compounded by the rise of radical Islam. It's a pretty volatile mix. And I suppose some people would say, well, then we better be there to keep it under control. But, my response is, where does it end? Or are we permanent policemen in that part of the world. This is what I mean when I say I don't think the lessons of Vietnam were properly learned. So I wanted to give my take on the situation, and the book has an epilogue that I believe is about 30 pages long, where I sort of assess things like, what have we learned, where do we stand, what's going on these days that could be better, could be different if we had really learned the lessons of the era of the Vietnam War. And I don't restrict those obligations only to I don't restrict those observations only to our military posture overseas, because the war at home was going on at the time too. Now the anti-war protests served as a catalyst for everything, but that wasn't the whole story. The civil rights movement was going on. There was a growing awareness of the unequal treatment of women at the time. Here in Minneapolis, the American Indian movement started. There was even the very faint beginnings of the gay rights movement. That didn't become very significant until later. But these things were going on, and for people to accept a just solution to those problems, and especially race, I should say that slavery was certainly America's original sin, and racism is its bastard child. And I think it's what's always kept this nation from realizing its full potential. And that was challenged back in the 60s with the Civil Rights Movement. Johnson made tremendous strides with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and imposing changes on the South specifically, but by the power of the federal government, using federal troops to integrate the schools. Not the most desirable way to do it, but sometimes it turned out to be the only way. So this stuff was going on, and instead of continuing that fight and people responding to what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, realizing that there have been great historical injustices here, and this is an opportunity. Too many people saw that not as an opportunity, but as a threat to their way. I'm talking about white people. Too many white people saw it as a threat to their way of life. They thought they see it as a zero-sum game. If ethnic minorities get more, there'll be less for us. And quite frankly, I think they saw it as a threat to not just to their economic status, but to their very identity. Because the people who are on the second rung from the bottom are always the most sensitive about their status. They say, okay, some people call us poor whites, white trash, or whatever, but at least we're not, who, on the bottom step. And they saw the civil rights movement as a threat to their own status. So, and this is where the title comes in Liberating Strife. I'm not talking certainly only about war and battle there. I'm talking about the fight for justice. I think the single most predominant theme that runs through the whole book is the word freedom. What does it mean? What are our obligations to others? This is the question all of us who are drafted have to ask. What is our obligation to the nation? When does ensuring the freedom of others start to impinge on our own? And on the domestic front, when does granting full voting rights, property rights, the right to live where you want, to all people, when does that start to infringe on the rights of people who see themselves as on the second step of, as I described it? Because, the common phrase used back then to oppose the civil rights movement was states' rights. What does that mean? Obviously, when you're talking about rights, you're talking about some kind of freedom. Well, what they were talking about was the freedom to deprive a whole race of other people of their rights. So, is it always necessary that securing one person's freedom means impinging on another's? You know, we live in a complicated society, and in order to enjoy the benefits of collective enterprise, we have to give something up as well. So this is why I say the concept of freedom is the defining theme that runs through the whole book, because and the reason for that is because in that era of American history, that question was discussed, you know, often sometimes by words, sometimes by violence, and I don't think we arrived at the correct answer. The last election, we saw one of the candidates making blatant appeals to racism, but it didn't start with him. After the Voting Rights Act passed, Nixon came up with the Southern strategy. Instead of appealing to the better angels of our nature, making this a more perfect union and saying, let's build on, these laws are just. Doesn't the Declaration of Independence say all men are created equal? That we all have the rights to pursue life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, Now we're finally making that a reality. Obviously it wasn't true for centuries. Slavery was in effect. It wasn't true after the Civil War either, because a campaign of domestic terrorism was waged in the South to oppress the former slaves and their progeny. And so it didn't happen. So now with the Civil Rights Act, here's an opportunity. Instead of seizing that and appealing to the better angels of Americans' nature, Nixon and the hard right, and that reached its climax with Reagan, they took the other tack and said, let's appeal to the bad angels of America's nature. Nixon called it the Southern strategy. He made no bones about it. He said that this breaks the solid South. Johnson knew it too. When he signed the Civil Rights Act, the story is he said, this means we've lost the South for a generation, by we meaning the Democratic Party. And so that was another motivation for writing the book. The international military, international affairs lessons haven't been learned, but the domestic ones haven't either. There's been tremendous progress made, but a lot of that was by simply the power of the federal government. Quite frankly, a lot of the emotions, the resentment, the alienation that led to the Civil War are still alive and well in America today. And you see that in our noxious political environment, the belief that government, Reagan, remember what Reagan said, government is not the solution, government is the problem. That's a very toxic message to promote to the American public, because there's a lot of people who are vulnerable to that. They see themselves cheated, and they're right. Yeah, they've been cheated, but not by the government. They've been cheated by the plutocracy that's running this place. The ones that control the national media, the ones that control the elections by their huge political contributions, and the party in power maintains that, and basically by cheating, by gerrymandering, and by vote suppression, very carefully selected segments of the population, and by making remember when McCain-Feingold, the campaign finance reform was a big thing, and bipartisan, John McCain, of course, being a Republican. Well, what happened to that? We live in an era of basically pay to play. You buy influence through large campaign contributions. We were talking briefly earlier about the book Dark Money, about how these private foundations can influence public opinion. And what's especially irritating about that is that these quote-unquote contributions to these private foundations are tax deductible. So I haven't finished the book yet, but like you said, my blood pressure can only take so much. But these are all examples of what I mean by the challenge that was issued to the nation by the civil rights movement back in the same era. Again, the theme is freedom. The challenge that was issued was never accepted by a large sector of the American population. Instead, it was met with rejection. And, the result is that a lot of smart people, rich people on the right wing, have learned how to exploit these feelings among certain sectors of the electorate to get them to vote against their own economic self-interest. They've solved the problem. They're the party of money, the right wing. But as much money as they have, the other party, natural division, this is what Thomas Frank talks about in What's the Matter with Kansas, the other natural division, the party of numbers and the party of money. And of course that's basically the Republicans and the Democrats. So the problem that's posed to the people with the money is how do we get control of institutions because we don't have the numbers? Solution, get people to vote against their own economic self-interest. Well, how do we do that? By appealing to the negative side of their emotions. The most obvious, and Nixon was right, the Southern strategy was a winning strategy. The most obvious one is appeal to racism. This was a motivation for writing the book, because I think we could do better. I think we have to do better. Unfortunately, I think the problem is pretty well defined. A lot of writers have done some excellent work. Thomas Frank, Paul Krugman, Hendrik Smith, and now Jane Mayer with Dark Money. They've done a pretty good job, and they've done their homework. They've done their research. They've defined the problem. They told us exactly what happened, how this plutocracy got control of our government, our institutions. Unfortunately, the solution is more elusive, but I wanted to at least give my take on it in the book, and then I believe that's all one person can do.
So you initially say there was this angry young guy
Mm-hmm.
and the somewhat more tempered older guy.
Maybe I'm not sounding like that today.
Well, I was just wanting to ask at the end about that. I think you at 70 are sounding pretty angry about the fact that, you've lived through all of this. There's all of this stuff that we could have learned from, and it doesn't seem like the country has learned anything.
You're probably right, Peter, but I prefer to use the term, instead of angry, disappointed.
Yeah.
You see, when the Cold War ended, remember when the Soviet Union fell, remember all the talk about the peace dividend? What happened to that? What was meant by the peace dividend was that all the money that we've been having to spend on the military, not all of it, but a big chunk of it, now that the Soviet Union wasn't such a viable threat anymore, would be used for domestic purposes, infrastructure, education, human services. That never happened. And, I had this idea that, well, finally, the greatest generation has won their last victory. They brought the Soviet Union to their knees. They defeated the Axis in World War II, and then came what Kennedy described as the long twilight struggle. Finally, that's over, and now maybe there can be a Pax Americana, and we can show the world what a prosperous, the most prosperous country in the history of the world, what we can do with these resources when they're used for productive, positive things, instead of having to sink so much into national defense. That never happened.